bracket 4 hours early.
All right, we are live. Welcome, everybody, to the Gunner Technology Livestream, a weekly tech talk for non-techies and techies alike. I'm your host, Jerry Merkins. With me is CEO of Gunner Technology, Cody Swan. What's up, Cody?
Oh, not much. Just checking out the brackets and everything, getting ready.
Yeah, and for YouTube's, because they only caught the tail end of what you were saying. What did ESPN do?
I guess somehow via the app, they released the NCAA women's bracket 4 hours early because ESPN
and nobody
broadcast it. So they must have known, and they allowed you to pick. They allowed you to pick the games before they were actually announced.
Well, that's huge news.
So I know. I mean,
surprised I didn't hear about that because that's a big deal. Speaking of big deals, I guess we can dive right into our Country Shore giveaway. Country Shore is a lifestyle brand for anyone who loves the outdoors. You can visit them at countryshoreoutfitters.com. The winner this week, and I'm going to butcher the name, I apologize in advance. I think, though, it's Stradeep V, S-R-A-D-E-E-P, Stradeep, from Brooklyn, New York, excuse me. You won a Country Shore hat and copies of our ebooks, and we have 2 new ebooks actually dropping this week. So you've got just a ton of Gunner Technology stuff heading your way, along with the Country Shore hat. So anyone who didn't win this week can sign up on our Facebook page and also answer our question of the week, which this past week we had a huge response. The question of the week this past week was, come on. It's like, it really is like a mental block. I'm not going to look it up. Oh, Facebook was down last Wednesday, I think it was. And the question of the week was, did you notice and or care? And 75% of people, 3/4 of people, just about, did notice and or did care, which is surprising to me, but I guess good news for Facebook.
Yeah. I mean, Facebook could use some good news these days. So if no one's if no one cares, yeah, they're hurting, man. I guess I remember
think
last year.
WhatsApp for businesses dropping today, maybe. I think that was in the news.
You know what's funny is the Facebook is trying a lot of other things. Like they have this. I bet most people haven't even seen it, but they have like this Facebook workplaces thing where like you can have like it's like your own private Facebook, not your own profile, but like your own private Facebook for your company. So you can like use Facebook at a
like an internal social network
and like share documents. And I don't know, man. I don't know. Keep Jeff Bezos off that thing, man. You don't want those pictures going around your internal network, man. I'll tell you what.
Or any sort of external network, any network. Just keep those off all the networks. Yeah, it's tough. The question of the week this coming week, I saw a documentary, and it's sort of maybe a couple of years old now. This story of a guy who was accused of murder and got off because he was on camera during a Curb Your Enthusiasm episode. There was the episode where Larry David picks up a prostitute so he can use the what do you call it? Is it the HOV lane where he can drive with?
Yes.
You have more than one person. So he grabs a prostitute so he can drive in the HOV lane so he can get to the Dodgers game on time. But during the filming of that episode, they actually caught the guy and his daughter sitting in the stands. So it basically got him off of a murder charge.
Okay.
But my question is, based on that, like if they hadn't had that footage, and I guess there were cell phone records too that sort of put him there, but if he hadn't made a phone call and there wasn't footage of him at the ball game, his alibi was totally toast. So would you ever install a GPS tracker in yourself so that there was a record of where you were at all times?
I mean, look, I don't really care if people know where I am. So
you're firmly in the yes category. I also would be firmly in the yes category.
Yeah.
And I think there actually is a service now that does it, or there's one where you can swallow a pill, and I think that's how it does it. But I think there's one that goes under the skin, so you kind of like, what's that?
It's called the Matrix.
Yes, you take the red pill, and then you wake up in a tub of goo. But there is one that goes under the skin too. Like I think it's called HomeAway, is a thing for pets where you can track your pets if they get lost.
Okay.
And I'm wondering if parents would do it, like put GPS in their kids so they could track where their kids are at all times. So it sort of eliminate that.
How does the battery life work on that thing? Like, do you have to change the battery? You have to dig it out? Is it like?
a good question. I did absolutely no research other than looking to see if there was any sort of solution. Maybe it's solar powered. Maybe just it's
Okay.
like your Birdman. You have to just stand in the sun to recharge your GPS. Um,
With your wings spread.
yeah, exactly. But I'm curious to see if anyone would be hesitant to do that, because I could see. I guess I could kind of see the hesitancy, maybe
I,
sort of misuse, or it would enable stalking if people were able to access the record somehow, or I don't know. But I think it's better safe than sorry.
So I was reading something about a national security concern about all these mobile trackers via ads and your cell phone, and they were saying basically that foreign agencies were were buying the data to try to figure out, pinpoint who was like worked at high
Oh, I
security.
see. I see. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So
Based
they,
on what buildings they went in and stuff.
because it's kind of anonymized, but you can see, okay, this person goes from this address,
Yeah.
which is a residential address,
Yep.
to this nuclear power plant every day. So then you just reverse look up the home address they're going to, and you get their name, and then you basically compromise them into giving you nuclear secrets, kind of thing.
My goodness,
Yeah,
that
yeah.
is nefarious. I hadn't thought of that. I mean, I guess maybe it wouldn't be good for nuclear scientists.
Right, or like spies. If you're a spy, probably if you work at the
If you're a spy,
CIA.
you don't want a GPS tracker in you.
Right, right.
Or if you're a criminal. If you're a criminal, you probably don't want a GPS tracker in you.
Correct. That reminds me the Robert Kraft thing, which is big news around here since he got busted at like massage parlor, which was acting as a prostitution ring for
I guess technically it's a parlor. I would say massage parlor.
massage parlor. And so he got busted along with a lot of other people in like this prostitution ring that was using like Chinese sex slaves, for lack of a better term.
Yeesh.
And his lawyers came out right away, categorically denies that this happened. Right, categorically denies. Yet they filed a motion to prevent the release of any public video or any videos of Robert Kraft doing what he didn't do.
I guess cover your bases.
Right. So yeah, that's another technology wonder. Yeah,
that is. It didn't happen, and we also don't want footage of it didn't happen to get out.
Which is just incredible. The
lawyers, man, you gotta love them.
Oh man. Oh gosh, they would love a GPS thing like that. Anything that's controversial, lawyers love, because they're going to make money off of it one way or another.
Yeah, I wish Johnny Cochran was still around.
Is he dead? Did Johnny Cochran die?
He died of like a brain tumor like a decade ago.
Really?
Yeah,
Huh.
there's a whole bunch of conspiracy theories about how it was his Bluetooth, because he constantly had a Bluetooth headset on that caused his brain tumor.
Okay.
Yeah, which is just good science.
Yeah. I'm convinced.
If the GPS doesn't track, you must give them back. Anyways, we got a cool new series coming up. This is going to be a 10-part series. It's actually probably more than a 10-part series, because there's going to be a companion series of dev videos that sort of go into the more technical side of what we're going to talk about in sort of a broad overview in these 10 episodes. But we're going to be talking about two technologies along with a couple others. But basically, the major technologies we're going to talk about are React and Serverless, which are sort of the I don't want to say wave of the future, but it's what we've decided to use at Gunner Technology. It makes development that much easier. It makes managing code and your architecture just insanely simple compared to what we had to do even 5 years ago. So I'm not sure where to dive in. I think maybe the best place to start is React, because React sort of enables a lot of this stuff. So maybe just a 10,000-foot overview of what React is.
Yeah, so React solves one of the big problems that we see in development today, which is basically publishing native apps. It solves a lot of other problems, but the big problem that we use it for is publishing native apps, because almost no one wants, say, an iOS app and does not want an Android app, or vice versa. Pretty much standard these days, if you want one, you want the other. And the problem with that setup is, in order to publish these apps, you need to know, not only do you need to write the app twice, you need to write the app in two different languages twice. So in the case of iOS and Android, you're using Swift and or Objective C. In the case of Android, you're using Java and or Kotlin. So it eliminates that problem where you can write an app and publish it natively as an iOS app and or an Android app. Additionally, it's based in JavaScript. It is JavaScript, which is becoming, if not, it's becoming the de facto language of software development, just because it's what powers the internet. There's a ton of programming languages out there, and kind of each has strengths and weaknesses. But in the case where you can do almost everything with one language, that overrules a lot of the weaknesses of the language. So it allows you to hire kind of more ubiquitous developers who can kind of do everything from front end to back end. It's easier to find talent if you're just looking for someone who's skilled in one language. So React really is like the underpinning of the development part of this stack.
And just as an aside, a lot of the drawbacks of JavaScript have sort of been mitigated by just advancements in technology. So one of the huge drawbacks for the longest time is the fact that JavaScript was slow, but now we have these machines that are so powerful that I mean, you're talking about nanoseconds at that point, which is completely unnoticeable to the end user, or even on the back end. If you're doing some sort of process, it's not going to take that much longer anymore.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, and JavaScript started in the browser, and so not only has JavaScript gotten faster, but the runtimes, and not only has the hardware gotten better and the browser have gotten better, but the runtimes like V8 and the other
Yep.
runtimes that JavaScript run in have gotten a lot better. So your the difference in computational power masks a lot of the problems that JavaScript has as an uncompiled language versus compiled language like Java or C++.
And maybe a shout out to our original, our OG 4-part series was on the history of JavaScript. So I actually be kind of funny to go check that out and see how different this live stream was back then, because it was actually more than a year ago. I was still back east at that point.
Yeah,
Um,
that was like our first one, right?
that was our very first one,
Okay.
and we actually we touched a little bit on sort of the evolution of JavaScript and the history of JavaScript and how it sort of went from this clunky web language to these more powerful frameworks that are sort of used everywhere to actual standalone uh, sort of back end and front end languages and platforms. So maybe talk about what makes React different from, say, Angular or any of the other solutions out there.
So Angular is like a full stack solution, meaning it tells you how to do everything. It tells you how to make requests to the server. It tells you how to render your views. It tells you how to structure your code. It's what we call an opinionated framework. React is very unopinionated. It kind of lets you choose, how you want to fetch data, how you want to render the data. Everything is kind of control. Everything is kind of up to you in React. Also, what's different about React is it's kind of weird, and it was one of my biggest complaints about React until I kind of learned it and understood the philosophy behind it. Was you do everything in JavaScript, where for the longest time the holy grail of web development was the separation of layers, where you had CSS, HTML, and JavaScript, and you would separate the three. And it's kind of weird looking back at it. And it was nice because the theory was that you could have someone who knew CSS work on the CSS, and someone who knew HTML could work on the HTML, and someone who knew JavaScript could work on the JavaScript. And as that became more and more as that became more and more popular, it was more of a pipe dream than reality, because you really did have to know all three in order to get really anything done. And you really can kind of separate them in React. It just looks a lot different. It's all in the JavaScript files as opposed to being separated into a CSS file, an HTML file, and kind of a JavaScript file. So
I think
those are
there too. Sorry to cut you off, but uh, I mean, HTML isn't that tricky to learn on its own. HTML5 introduced a bunch of like weird stuff that you aren't going to use on a daily basis. But I think what's interesting with CSS is when stuff like Bootstrap came along, it made it that much easier to be able to do some really powerful stuff in CSS without really knowing all of the nitty gritty details of CSS. So it sort of opened the door to JavaScript developers being able to do the HTML and CSS on their own. And that sort of maybe paved the way for some of these frameworks to come along and fill that need.
Yeah, I mean, the advent of CSS frameworks, design frameworks, were a major boon for the development community because I mean, and you'll hear pushback on this mainly from people who
From
are
designers.
experts in CSS who
Yeah.
who don't like it. But the fact of the matter is, there's a reason that all stop signs look alike,
Right.
and really you want your web app, you want your website to be familiar to people when they come to it. You're not trying to reinvent the wheel. So what these design frameworks do really well is they provide an excellent base of commonalities where if you use it correctly, you should really just be changing the branding aspects of the template. Now, again, obviously, like a informational website is going to have some differences from like a website where you can play a video game on it. It's just going to be different in some respects. But there's so many commonalities to web apps in general, and websites that these CSS frameworks have stylistic guidelines for almost every scenario now.
So React is basically how you deliver the goods, more or less, how you sort of build the page out. And we sort of talked about a little bit. I think this is actually in a different series, but we talked about how pages get built via the code base, how it accesses the database and pulls data in and fills the pages up and makes them look pretty via CSS styling. Where does serverless come into play?
So serverless is the kind of like the part that users don't see. Serverless is that architectural backend where all of the data and things happen in the background. For example, if you are sending an email to someone, that happens on the back end. If you are getting data for a recipe, you're getting that from the back end. So serverless is like the data store that holds the data. It's the functions that retrieve that data from the data store. It's background functions that take care of like handling bulk operations, like sending email to 100,000 people. It's all that stuff that you don't see. It's the it's the indexing of search terms, where when you're storing new data, something has to index it for search. It's all that stuff that kind of happens in the background that the React portion of the app fetches, but all the other stuff happens in the background. That's the serverless component to it.
And maybe talk a little bit about historically how that happened.
Yeah, so basically everything was kind of deployed to a single server. So that meant, like, again, if you're talking about React, you would be building a React front end, which would be just basically at the end of the day is compiled down into JavaScript. And then you would host this on your server. And so when someone types in gunnertech.com, that server would send down that JavaScript. And then once the JavaScript was down on the person's browser, it would make requests back out to the same server for dynamic data, such as like, are you signed in? Or again, like ingredients for a recipe.
Mhm.
And it was all handled just by a single server, or in some cases, an array of servers. But all of them took care of doing everything, kind of thing.
So that might be a librarian at a desk that you ask basically all the questions to, as opposed to 1,000 librarians, any of whom you can go to with any question that you have, or basically an
Right.
infinite number, really.
Right, and like it was basically that the to extend the analogy, the librarian is sitting at her desk just waiting for you to uh, ask her a question, kind of
Yeah,
thing.
and you're paying her the whole time that she's just sitting
Right,
there
and
and
you're
nobody's
paying her
asking
to
her any
sit
questions.
there, even if she's not answering any questions. You're
Yeah,
paying her to sit
I
there
guess.
to wait to answer a question.
Yeah, and that is an interesting aspect of serverless too that maybe we could touch on is the fact that the infinite librarians aren't just sitting there waiting to be asked questions. They sort of pop in from the ether whenever somebody approaches the desk with a question.
Right.
So
It'd
you're
be
not
like,
paying for unused time.
right. It would be like building a librarian when you need to ask her a question and then destroying her or him or
When the
her
question's over.
when the question is over, kind of thing.
Yeah. So what is the integration between React and serverless? How is
So
that set up? How is that done?
there's nothing that has to, like, serverless and React are two different components. You can run React without serverless, and you can run serverless without React, obviously. And so the way this all works is we basically tie it all together on AWS. So when we deploy, say, a new version of our React app, one of our React apps, we push it to, actually, we don't push it to a server. We push it to something called AWS S3, which is just like a bucket. And just like the librarians we talked about, if no one is accessing your bucket, you're not being charged. And there's no server configurations to maintain. It's just a static file sitting there waiting to be accessed. And we actually serve it through what's called a CDN. In AWS cases, it's called CloudFront. And so what a CDN does is it'll cache the response for you, and it caches it across the globe. So let's say you're in Australia and you request gunnertech.com. The first time you do that, or the first time someone does that in Australia, it's going to go to S3. The request is going to go to S3. It's going to grab the data, or grab the static HTML and JavaScript, and send it back through the CDN. But the CDN is going to hold it there. Kind of think about it, holds it directly over Australia. So the next time someone from Australia request it, they don't go to S3. They get it right there. It's called close to them. It's really close to them. So they get it in nanoseconds rather than milliseconds or seconds, kind of thing.
Mhm.
And so we do that all over the world. So same thing, if you're in Boston and you request it, you're not going all the way to the S3 bucket. You're going to that Boston node to get the data. Same thing, Los Angeles, New Zealand, so forth and so on, kind of thing. And so then when that comes down, that the app, then once it's rendered on your device, then it starts making what are called the serverless requests. And so this will be like to get things for the ingredients for the recipe, or to make sure that you're logged in, or if you are logging in, it'll take care of handling the checks against the username and password and all that stuff. So that's kind of what the serverless integration with with React is.
Are there any other components that I know we use on a lot of our projects, but are they sort of widely used in terms of React and serverless? Other pieces of AWS or outside of AWS?
Yeah, so AWS, our serverless stack with AWS is quite extensive. So again, in the traditional world, like if you wanted to send text messages to your user, you would have to configure your server to be able to send text messages. And you may have to add some more servers, just so if we're sending a lot of text messages, the servers don't go down from sending too many text messages. Then if you wanted to say your app to send emails, you would again have to reconfigure your server to send emails. Same thing for just about everything. Data retrieval, you'd have to then add a layer for data retrieval. A database, you may have a separate server for a database, or you may just add it directly to the server that's sitting out there. With AWS and serverless, all of these things are separate. They're completely separate. They have nothing to do with one another. So you're just using what are basically called microservices. You're using services to do one thing. So like there's a service through AWS called SNS, and that sends push notifications, that sends text notifications. There's another service called SES, which sends emails. So if you want to start sending emails, you just integrate on the front end with SES. Same thing with like DNS, meaning mapping an IP address to a domain name like gunnertech.com. Route 53 does that. So there's a service for everything. And with AWS, you don't pay for it to just sit there and wait. You only get billed for it if it's actually needed. And it doesn't have a limit on how much you can request. So again, if you need 0 librarians, you are charged for 0 librarians. But if you need 1 billion librarians, you instantly get 1 billion librarians, and you pay for only the time that each one of them is actually doing something. As soon as they're done doing something, they're eliminated, and it goes back down to being 0 again. So it's basically on-demand resources that can scale infinitely.
Infinite scalability at sort of the lowest possible price.
Correct. Exactly. And so the serverless is like, it's weird because it's like the next, you were talking about like the future, and everything is kind of the future, which is really weird, is because like there was this big thing called like, well, there is a big thing called like DevOps and containerization. And so containerization is basically sticking all these things that we're talking about into a single container. And then you can take that container and deploy it anywhere, where a server is kind of stuck. You can't just move it. Like a container, you can move from your laptop to the cloud to an on-premise machine, on-premise location, and all that stuff. And then almost as soon as containerization became extremely popular, serverless has started replacing it as the next thing. So it's just kind of funny. And then you have people who will argue, and there are still some use cases for containers that serverless doesn't necessarily solve yet. But it's just crazy to see how quickly we're evolving. And again, I'm sure something else will come along to replace serverless. But right now, it is definitely the best option to combine security, because like no one can hack your code if it's serverless. Like they can't compromise your code because
it's ephemeral. Because it just disappears.
Exactly. Thank you. Exactly. It's not going to be there. So if someone compromised your code, it doesn't matter because it's gone. It gets spun up new every single time. So you can't really compromise it. It's handled all internally in our case by AWS. It's scalable, as we talked about, infinitely, and it's cost efficient. And the cool thing about we wrap it in a service called Serverless Framework, which makes managing code and writing code for serverless very easy, because as you just heard, like if you have all these different microservices, it can be unwieldy to actually manage and develop for it, because, oh, I made changes to 3 services. How do I deploy all 3 kind of thing? Well, Serverless Framework makes that, it provides a wrapper over all these microservices that makes managing them and updating the backend very easy.
Any drawbacks to serverless?
Well, yeah, I mean, like I said, it kind of like, because it's all separate, kind of getting them to talk and manage deployments can be kind of a headache, but it's kind of one of those things where you have to figure it out. The biggest drawback that we see with serverless is local deployment or local development. And so with local development, you can't put all of AWS on your local machine. You just can't. In the case of containers and traditional servers, you can replicate your production environment almost exactly on your local machine. But with serverless, you can't say put like what's an example? You can't put Dynamo hooks or Dynamo triggers rather on your local machine. There's just some stuff you can't put on your local machine. It's not that big of a deal because each developer can if you do serverless right, each developer can have their own serverless deployment on AWS, and they get charged pennies. However, the downside of that is you can only work if you have connectivity. That becomes less and less of an issue because everywhere you go now you have connectivity. So
exactly.
That's the only downside, is that you kind of have to deploy small changes if you're working locally. So it's not like immediate. Like you want to make a few changes to the back end, it maybe takes like a minute to deploy them. So that's the biggest downside.
What about it? Is there a steep learning curve for people coming from more traditional architectures?
There's really not, if you use something like Serverless Framework to manage it, because it makes it feel like Serverless Framework kind of makes it feel like you're working in a monolithic framework, which is what most people are familiar with, but allows them to have the true serverless kind of separation of responsibilities.
We had a question. Sorry, go ahead. Finish that.
No, I would say it really is easy to pick up if you're moving from kind of a traditional background to a serverless mindset.
We have a question on Periscope, and I wonder if this is a Twitter insider. Are you nervous about React with the state of Facebook?
Yeah. So that's a good question. That's a good question, because Facebook kind of owns React. It's open source, so they don't own it, but they manage it. It was a Facebook product that they released and open source. And so the question is basically, if Facebook goes away, am I concerned about React going away? Not really, because the community is so freaking large right now with React that it might be, it might suffer a little bit, because I think that the innovation curve, because Facebook's constantly releasing updates to React. So I think until it found a steady group of maintainers to replace Facebook, it might slow down in terms of new features. But I'm not worried at all about React not being maintained. And even at the point that it would not be maintained, it would be because something better came along anyway and replaced it.
Do we want to touch on React Native here at the end a little bit?
Yeah, so React is basically, so React Native is what's called a subset of React. So it's the same syntax of React, but it's built in a different environment. So React is built in a web environment. React Native is built in a native environment, meaning either Java/Kotlin or Objective-C/Swift. And the reason that is so it can be run on either of those devices, iOS or Android. And even there, so that again was a Facebook thing. But again, to the point of, am I worried about Facebook or React going away if Facebook goes away? A company called Expo largely picked up a lot of the React Native innovation. And so one of the really big pains in the butts about native development is deploying new versions of your app to the app stores. And Expo, along with a number of other features, makes that drop dead easy. You can actually do like what are called OTA updates, which is, again, solves a big problem. So like, let's say we have a version of our application and we get it approved in the app store. And then we're like, oh crap, there's a bug. Well, we have to then submit an update to the app store and sit there and wait for Apple employees to approve the update, which can take a day. It could take a week. And they may reject your app. Even though your app is approved and all you're submitting is a bug fix, they may reject the app for whatever
Something
reason.
they didn't catch before.
Right, exactly. So with Expo, all you have to do is get the original app approved in the App Store, and then you can push updates to the app by using Expo's what's called OTA updates, which are over-the-air updates. So you can then just push a new version to Expo, and your app in the App Store will automatically pick up that update, so you don't have to go through Apple's approval process, every single time you have a small update to push out.
So if you can use Expo with your React Native apps, is the lesson
exactly,
there.
exactly. Expo is a godsend. It probably right there with, I mean, I would say this is like, I know it's part of React Native, but like it's a trio of what has just revolutionized development. Is Expo, React, and Serverless is just literally almost the kind of the silver bullet for development.
Well, that's probably a great place to leave it. I'm not sure if we'll have a code video associated with this one. We might maybe just walk through the development setup, the setup of a local machine, because we're really going to sort of dive into the nuts and bolts of React and serverless development in the weeks ahead. And each of our live streams is going to have an associated, or maybe one, maybe more videos where we actually are going to build out an app. And maybe, I guess we could talk a little bit about what we're going to be building.
Yeah. Actually, it's so we're going to be working on a client app, which is basically an app that'll let you choose. It's like social crowdsourcing for decision making. So given two things, which should I go with, kind of thing. That's the premise of the app. Is like you have two things and you want to ask people, which one should I go with? You know, like maybe if you're thinking about like buying Air Jordans, or I don't even know what
It would have been good for March Madness. Who should I pick?
Right. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, it'll kind of be a build along app where we'll kind of build it as we go, kind of thing.
And the stack will be React, serverless, Expo, and React Native.
Yeah, exactly.
So I guess tune in for the next 9 episodes. We're going to build out a complete app using those technologies. But that's going to do it for this episode of the Gunner Technology Livestream. Make sure to hop on our Facebook page and enter the Country Shore giveaway. Country Shore is a lifestyle brand for anyone who loves the outdoors. You can visit them at countryshoreoutfitters.com. And while you're on our Facebook page, answer our question of the week, which this week is, would you install a GPS tracker in yourself so that everyone knew where you were all the time. That's not exactly how it's phrased, but that's the gist of it. So hop on our Facebook page and answer that question. You can check out the blog post for this episode at gunnertech.com. The podcast will be available on iTunes. Our ebooks are available on Amazon, iBooks, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, and anywhere else ebooks are sold. That's going to do it for this episode. We'll see you next Thursday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time for the next episode of the Gunner Technology Livestream. I'm Derry. That's Cody. We'll see you next week.